Hey, how's it going, everybody? So today I'm going to tackle what is a very touchy subject, and that is the nature of abortion and the non-aggression principle. Now, a lot of people struggle with this because there's a lot of heated debate over whether a child should be considered a human in terms of rights and responsibilities at conception or possibly at a later point when they're leaving outside the womb. But I'd like to take a fresh look at this from a principled standpoint so that it's very clear the hierarchy of rights and responsibilities between mother and child from a logically consistent non-aggression principle perspective. So first and foremost, we want to look at the nature of the act of procreation. Procreation is something that is necessary to the biological development and creation of humans as a species. You cannot have human beings without procreation. Evolutionarily, you have tons of creatures throughout history reproducing and growing and evolving to eventually create the humans that are today. So with that in mind, the nature of procreation really is something that is a biological foundation. It's something that is a predicate to even having human beings, the rational actors about which we're speaking of, to have this rational philosophy. So we cannot really delve into philosophy and ethics here without even having human beings existing at the onset. If there's no human beings to discuss these things and to have these things applied to, we really don't have a philosophy worth any type of application. So with that in mind, if we take a look at the act of procreation as a pure biological function, we could compare this more to an act of, say, breathing or producing blood. In other words, the act of procreation is really just kind of this default state that brings about the existence of human beings. Now, some will try to say that a man and a woman choose to have sex and that this choice happens to lead to creating a child. However, the fact that parents have sex is really immaterial to the nature of procreation. Again, procreation happens in animals and other creatures with or without necessarily having this type of consent or direction about this. For many of the lower ordered organisms, it's instinctual. And so thinking about it this way will help us create a more clear backdrop to applying the non-aggression principle to abortion. So as the creation of children is an activity that happens without consent of the child, that is, a child doesn't ask to be born, it becomes really difficult to apply the non-aggression principle to an activity that inherently involves one party not being able to give consent to their creation. And because of this, it supports the idea that the act of procreation should be viewed more as a biological function. If we cannot really build a foundation of consent with two parties, it appears more to be something that relates to biological function that's more of a status rather than two sentient beings who can interact with each other. As we're taking a look at this from the perspective of a biological function where there is no consent, we can come up clearly on the idea of the mother having her pre-existing body rights as being superior to the child. Walter Block has spoken about this at length, talking about the concept of evictionism, the idea that a mother has a higher priority to her body, and so a child's presence in her body means that she can eject or evict a child from her body. Now, Walter Block makes some distinctions here and tries to suggest that if there is any reason that the child could survive out of the womb, that the mother should make best efforts to permit that survival to happen. I would say to reject that concept, as the nature of birthing itself comes with many variables that make it clear that it is not a subject ripe for the non-aggression principle's application to the child. For example, with miscarriages, the body naturally rejects the child out of the body as it develops. And miscarriages can happen at many stages, which is why it's sometimes hard to calculate the exact percentage, but a good number, about 20 to 40% of conceptions, lead to miscarriage. And the factors of miscarriage are actually things that could be controlled for, that is, known about and avoided, whether it's being obese, smoking, drinking, participating in certain physical activities that can increase miscarriage risk, or genetic predisposition to miscarriage. So with these things in mind, if we were to hold a standard that the child is to be treated with priority, and that the action of killing a child from ejection of the womb is to be considered murder, we get into a very murky area where a woman could be considered responsible for her negligence or recklessness that leads to miscarriage. If this is confusing, just compare this to texting and driving. If someone was texting and driving and they were not paying attention and ran over a child, they would be considered at fault for that risk that they took that led to the harm or death of a child. In the same way, any woman who is procreating with these known risk conditions is no different than someone who is texting and driving. And if that miscarriage takes place, it is no different than the accident of someone who hits a child. It is the same concept, a risk taken on that knowingly could lead to a child's death. As people generally don't want to make this case, even those who are staunch pro-lifers, it doesn't really fit that this would be held consistently. It's very difficult to suggest that the child's life and priority would be given a top priority and be considered murder when people are making special pleading cases that miscarriage should be looked at with a lesser standard, as if women shouldn't be investigated constantly whenever miscarriages take place to see if they contributed to that factor. Again, nobody would accept if someone texted and drove 5 times and each of those times a child died. They'd say this person was acting recklessly and causing death. The same would be true of someone who is obese and trying to get pregnant, or who has a genetic predisposition, or has had past miscarriages. All these factors are known factors that lead to miscarriage, and if you wouldn't accept someone texting and driving and then running over a child, you should not accept women trying to procreate when there are known risk factors. Looking at other types of logical fallacies and extremes that emerge, we can see that there really isn't a strong consistency for the N.A.P application, with consent not being had at the onset. If consent is to be held at a priority when it comes to procreation, then one should follow the logic that procreation should not happen, as children cannot be produced with their consent, as they do not exist yet and have their sentience from their mind. Human beings should stop having babies if you wish to uphold consent as a higher priority. Again, you cannot have this basis of consent and the child as a priority logically with the N.A.P and procreation, because fundamentally it is an act that does not involve the consent of the child. Further, if a child were to be considered owed a duty, there is an ambiguity about what that duty entails. A child could make a claim that they are owed sustenance for life because they did not choose to be born. This idea of a parent taking care of a child till 18 is illusory and wanton. It doesn't have any concrete form. A child should be able to say that they are owed food and housing and shelter for their entire lives because they never got a chance to choose. Or, if we took another extreme, we could think about the property rights of the mother in creating the child. For example, the child's body is a product of the mother's cells and the food she ingests, and her blood, which is supplied to the child. If you look at it that way, the body of a child is effectively the pieces of property from the mother. One could argue that a child owes their parents labor or their bodies for life because the child's body is a product of the parents' bodies and a product of their property. Of course, this type of argument, which appears to lend credence towards slavery, is absurd and should be rejected, like the other absurdities that we can see when we try to apply consent ethics to a situation that arose itself without two-party consent. Because of this, the ethical outcome is to reject a non-aggression principle application to the nature of conception, to give women the highest priority of their bodies in being able to eject children from their bodies, and to simultaneously, after the fact, hold no duty as a standard of care for parents toward children, and simultaneously, parents cannot restrict a child from getting sustenance that they need. This is important to avoid actively causing harm toward a child, but also not putting on absurd, limitless duties on parents and children. We can also think about this through a form of logical estoppel. That is, the idea of saying you would not want something and so it shouldn't be done to you in the way that you want to do it to others. So for example, if you do not wish to have someone else be attached to your body and live off of it for 9 months, it would be reasonable to suggest that neither would a mother want an unwanted person attached to their body living off of it for 9 months. With all these factors in mind, the nature of reducing abortions and helping women who do not want their children should come through market and social norms. This is not weird, as with most anything involving the state, there's already a compared to what. There are already safe haven drop boxes for mothers who do not want their children. In a free society, women would be able to offer up their children to hospitals or other types of care organizations who would care for unwanted children. People would be free to educate men and women about safe contraception and alternatives to having an abortion, and people would be free to help those who are in need take care of their kids should there be an issue that arises with a mother or father's ability to take care of their kids. When the pieces of this puzzle are put together logically as we have, you can see a very consistent pattern emerge that respects the body and property rights of a mother, the body and property rights of a child when appropriate, and allows for people to, without violence, help reduce the number of abortions that take place through voluntary education and voluntary help. If you have any thoughts, I'd be happy to hear them down below, and I look forward to furthering this discourse to help promote principled liberty. Take care, everyone.